Whoa, that was different. Okay, so hello everybody, welcome back to Wow. There's an expert on my screen, and today we have an expert, Hannah Gabriel, who is an associate professor. Yeah, associate professor of economics at Sacramento State University, and she's here to tell us about things she does, her research, and all the kind of cool stuff that she does as an economist. And of course, I'll be asking questions and paying attention and whatnot. So not to take away from her time, Hannah, why don't you go ahead and tell us your stuff?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me on the program. So my research broadly focuses on international economics, so international trade and international finance. And so I look a lot at the banking sector in financial Europe. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my papers that I wrote that concerns the Hungarian financial sector and, sort of some changes that happened and how that's affected various firms and businesses in Hungary. So just a little bit of background. Hungary is a former communist state that went through a transition to a market-based economy from a planned Soviet-style economy in the late 80s, early 90s. And so part of the transition from a planned economy to a market-based economy involves financial sector reform. And so going from, the government controls all your banking sector and, they tell you what you do, to all of a sudden opening up these private banks, kind of like similar to what we have in the US, the Bank of America type thing.
Right.
And so with these reforms in the early 90s, this left kind of an opening for foreign banks to kind of establish a presence in Hungary. Mm-hmm. And this happened all over Central Europe with the fall of the Iron Curtain. And so what happened in Hungary is that both these Hungarian banks opened up, owned by Hungarian nationals, and then these international banks opened up, owned by, Italian banks or Dutch banks, German banks are the big ones. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is this led to kind of an increase in the financial presence of Hungary, and Hungary became a big exporting nation. So while this was all happening, Hungary also was trying to join the EU, and they finally joined in the early 2000s, along with a lot of other Central European countries. And so this was great. They kind of became more globalized, kind of more internationally involved, and including most of their, trade and financial business was done with other Western European countries. So countries like Italy and Germany. Mm-hmm. And so this was all, early 2000s, this was great. And then all of a sudden, in about 2010, Hungary elected a far right president, Viktor Orban, who is pretty well known for being Eurosceptic, meaning
he's a fun guy.
Not a fan of the EU. Yeah, he kind of has had these harsher immigration laws, all of these things like that. And so one of the lesser known features of his presidency was this skepticism of international banking. So this didn't get as much attention as, some of the obviously more
other bigger things. Yeah.
The bigger issues, the immigration and the any
homophobia
sort of
and all the other stuff.
Yeah. So those were the bigger issues, but he also ran on a platform of kind of making the Hungarian banking sector more Hungarian and less international. So the reason for this, there was no, overarching, predictable reason. He just decided that we didn't want international banking, we wanted Hungarian banking. Right. And so what I look at in this paper is there were these two banks in Hungary. One was owned by a US bank and one was owned by a German bank, and they went up for sale. And so what Viktor Orban's government did is they purchased these two banks with the intention of flipping them from international banks to domestic banks. Mm-hmm. And so basically this kind of led to a period of turmoil where, the banks became a little bit worse. And so what I find in my paper is that after this happened, after these banks effectively switched from multinational banks to a domestic Hungarian bank, is that loans fell from the firms that borrowed from this bank. So these, and I split this up so that there's these two types of firms that I look at in my data set: multinational affiliates and domestic firms. And so this is a whole separate line of research, but the multinational firms tend to be these huge, conglomerations like your GE, your Mercedes, like countries that are headquartered somewhere else, but they have operations in Hungary. And so these tend to be, they have more employees, they have more higher revenue, sales, exports. So I'm looking largely at exporting and trade.
Right.
And then you have your domestic firms, which are you're not your mom and pop shops, but your smaller firms that are, owned by Hungarians, and they operate in Hungary and they export abroad. Okay. And so what I find is that after these banks switched over and they were kind of more poorly run and they had these more problems, basically the firms that borrowed from this bank weren't able to take out as much money as they wanted. They weren't able to borrow and get a loan as high as they wanted. And so their loans fell. But this result was different across the different types of firms. So multinational firms didn't have any effect on their loans because they're so big, they can, borrow from multiple different banks and they're able to kind of work around this problem. But these smaller banks are more likely to only borrow from one or two banks, so that if one of them is hit with this turmoil, you can't take out as much money because it's harder for you. Right. And so what I found, kind of the big overarching takeaway that's a little bit in the weeds, is that after you enact these far-right anti-global banking policies, the firms you're actually hurting are your domestic, locally owned firms, and not these, big international punching bags that, people, talk about they don't like. And so it's kind of a counterintuitive result, but it makes more sense that, you're harming yourself domestically. And so my takeaway from this is that, this isn't only a problem in Hungary. There are other countries that are thinking about trying to turn internally on their banking sector. And, I kind of offer a word of warning that this might not be the best solution, that these international banks might actually have some benefit in your country. And so, there's a talk in Poland, because they're also having some far right increasing presence, about turning a lot of these international banks into Polish banks. And I argue that, maybe we should be more careful. This is also, applicable to Brexit, other things like that, where these anti-European, anti-global sentiments can actually backfire and hurt yourself, but they gain a lot of attention on the news because, it's catchy to be like, us first, that's
We're
great.
Against the system.
But really, there is a benefit to globalization, particularly in the financial sector in your country.
Gotcha.
So that's the main finding that I have.
That's super. So I don't know if you know this, but both of my parents worked for the FDIC. So, so like bank regulation is something I heard a lot about when I was at home. So like, everything you said, makes total sense. I guess in essence, he's almost deregulating his financial sector, which even in the United States is happening bits and pieces here and there, where they're taking away these holdings on these banks that were put there for a good reason, to kind of delay that boom bust cycle that capitalism is kind of known to follow. And now he's eliminating this international competition, this flow of money that I would assume that Hungary really needs, since it's a former Soviet bloc country. And he's relying on his own resources, and like no country has ever been able to truly do that. And I don't think in history, no one's that big, except for maybe like England in like the height of their empire, where they're like, we can do whatever we want, we're fine. So it's just really interesting that that's what he decided to do.
And it is so interesting because like even in the United States, which is arguably the one of the strongest financial and banking sectors in the world, we still have international banks. We still have Deutsche Bank branches and ING and places like that.
Right.
And so to immediately just close them all off, or to say like, no, these are going to be run by Americans, no matter what. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense. You should, I mean, not to say like, let the market decide, but the banks were, up for sale. They could have been bought and run as different international banks. It would have been fine, arguably less disruptive to the economy than just declaring them Hungarian no matter what. And so, and the stakes are so high in that industry that, this has spillover effects to both households and firms, and, messing with the banking sector is maybe arguably not a good idea.
Of all the industries, right, to have an effect on your overall general economy, the banking sector is the biggest one. And a lot of people don't like to think about it that way, because they're like, no, like I'm the hardworking guy who's out there making jobs and being a producer and stuff like that. But in reality, right, everybody needs loans.
Yeah.
Everybody needs that cash flow. They provide a service that is essential. And he's messing with the bankroll for his economy.
Yeah.
It's just,
it's really an interesting thing. And the fact that it's not just him, he's the only one that, I've studied in this great detail, but there are other places that are also considering this type of reform or this type of just movement. Really, it's something that you have to think about the consequences, but in a lot of these far-right governments, that's not necessarily the first thing. Isn't, oh, well, what consequences will this lead to?
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of people like, they're not in Europe, but like the guy who won in Brazil, Bolsonaro. I'm pretty sure he's doing a similar thing there. If he survives having COVID, because I'm pretty sure he got it. Or like, it also makes me think of like the people who are gaining in like France and the Netherlands, like Le Pen, and there's that Dutch guy, I don't remember his name, but he's cut from the same cloth. And he, I'm not sure if that's part of their platform, but it definitely runs in the same kind of political group that this guy does. And so like, and those are much larger economies with much more at stake than, not to crap on Hungary, but like
absolutely.
Right.
It is a really interesting thing to see it happen, and it's not just Central Europe. You're right. It's everywhere, even the US. This is in Asia, and it's a spreading anti-globalization type of movement, which is not unique to any region in the world by any means. And it's very interesting. There's so many lines of research to say, why is this happening? Why are people all of a sudden like, no more globalization? Or what are the consequences of doing so? Because, again, this is not just something that is financial. You can study the effects of migration, immigration, education, everything like that is kind of linked internationally now, because the world is increasingly global, and it's very hard to kind of cloister yourself away, but people seem to want that. And so, why is that the case is a very good question.
Ignorant people are scared. Generally my answer, but I'm not an expert. Now, one question I did have though about this is, since they are part of the EU, are they starting to get backlash from the European government, who does have the ability to affect their policy, at least minimally? Like, is the EU doing anything about this, or are they just kind of like, well, that's your choice?
So it's an interesting question. I think that the EU would maybe have a stronger ability to I don't know, intervene or make some sort of statement or something if Hungary was a Eurozone country, but they're not.
Right.
So they're kind of, in terms of like monetary and things like that, there are still some EU rules that they have to follow, but they're not nearly as strict as if they were on the euro.
Right. Okay, and so they still have whatever Hungarian money is.
It's the florent, I think, or forint.
That sounds right.
I just see the abbreviation. I can't remember the exact currency.
Yeah.
And so they could maybe face stronger repercussions if maybe they were trying to join the Eurozone, which is never going to happen under Orban.
No.
So it's
that ship sailed a long time ago.
you're allowed as an EU country to enact your own domestic policies.
Right.
That's part of that whole treaty.
That's the Maastricht Treaty, right?
Yes. And then, it's very specific, like you have to join, you have all of these conditions, but then once you're in, you have a lot more freedom.
Right.
So it's basically like, studying really hard to get into college, and then you're in college and you can just kind of do whatever you want. And
I don't know about
whatever
that
classes you want, like get whatever GPA lets you just kind of like scrape through. That's kind of,
definitely
and
don't
so
understand.
you might say that's unfair to all the candidates that have to follow all these really hard rules to get into the EU in like the Balkans. Whereas like once you're in, you can start acting however. It's just kind of the way it works.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting, I mean, I understand why that is the way it is, but considering the problems the EU has had with some of its member states that aren't Hungary, but like, for instance, like Greece or Spain or Italy, countries whose, when the financial crisis hit, really tanked. And then all of a sudden the EU had a lot of control over what they were doing. I feel like that rule of we need to have these really strict rules to get in, like a ceiling that you have to get above, but then after that you're free to dip back below it, is really like not forward thinking on their part. Especially since they saw what happened when 3 or 4 of your member countries dip, and then you're like, oh, now what happens?
And it was very much so I teach international finance, so we talked about this a lot in the spring when I taught this, particularly the Greece, Italy to some extent, but not nearly.
They weren't as bad, but not as bad as Greece, but
and Portugal and Spain also to some extent. And what happened was this was basically uncharted territory. Everyone before the financial crisis had done a very good job.
Right.
And it was very, optimistic of them to set these standards, but they were all kind of crushing it, and it was very good.
Mm-hmm.
And then the global financial crisis hit, and it was basically uncharted territory. So if they deviated so much more than ever before in terms of the criteria and stuff for being a Eurozone member and an EU member, which are not the same thing. And so they had to effectively come together. The ECB had to decide, okay, are we going to change the way we handle this when it happens, or are we going to say what we said back in the day and just do nothing and let like everything go crazy?
Let them fail,
And they kind of decided on some sort of intermediate compromise, which, as you said, was a lot more direct involvement of the ECB into Greece's monetary system, or central bank and monetary.
A lot of austerity. Which is never very popular.
And since these reforms that I studied in Hungary didn't crash the economy or anything like that, it was just like these slight distortions that kind of backfire, but like not in a major way, that they just kind of like, because the scope of it and the scale of it was nowhere near the global financial meltdown. It was just, my loan fell by 200, which is a lot for a small firm, but it's not your entire economy just took a
crash. Nosedive.
So it was a largely kind of an independent movement that didn't face much direct involvement.
Gotcha. Yeah, it makes you wonder, I guess, going back to what we were talking about earlier, if how closely they're monitoring stuff like that, knowing that political ideology is on the rise. Like I don't know how much like wiggle room in there, like what they're allowed to do, but like I'm sure they have some sort of plan in place, or at least they think they have something that's going to do what they're going to do if that happens on a larger scale in their zone. Because I can't imagine what would happen if the Eurozone fell that like crashed that hard. Like it would be as considerable, I guess, as like a stock market crash on our end. If that big of an economic zone fell apart.
Hope it doesn't. Me
neither.
I don't know what plans or anything they have in place, but I'm sure that's very much on their mind, because you have the 20 some member nations, and then
Right.
I forget how many are in the Eurozone, and trying to like herd cats, they're all going to be wanting to do whatever. So you have to kind of make sure everyone's on track, and that's not an easy task by any means.
Yeah.
Particularly if all of a sudden people are hostile to the concept of the EU.
To the actual.
Then it's just even,
Yeah. It kind of makes me think of like the United States before we adopted the Constitution, and all the states were like, we're going to do whatever we want. And then the government would be like, hey, can we have some money? And they'd be like, no.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's hurting cats, and they're not gonna, cats don't listen. And neither do nations, apparently. So, there we go. We've solved international politics.
Right. It's just difficult. That's all.
Yeah.
No, I don't envy the people that are in charge of doing that sort of thing. I just get to look at it from the academic standpoint. But
yeah, a much safer spot to look at it from.
Oh yeah.
Gotcha.
The stakes are a little bit lower.
Mm-hmm. The one other question I had is about Hungary's relationship with Russia. They're a former Soviet state, and I know a lot of those countries for a long time really tried to distance themselves from the Soviet Union financially, politically. But now that's kind of been changing. And I know Orban he's a nationalist, but I'm sure him and Putin are buddies. And not only that, but I know that Russia supplies like all of Europe with natural gas, or the majority of Europe with natural gas. So they're all kind of dependent on him in that way. Is Hungary's relationship with Russia affecting this at all, or like how much influence does Russia have on these decisions?
I'm not sure so much the relationship with Russia. I think that, like you said, they just have any sort of diplomatic relationship that you want to have when you have a international trade relationship like that.
Right.
But I think that the motivation, or part of the motivation for the Orban and the far right, is that because they had to face such strict criteria to join the EU all of a sudden became like a very annoying, like rigid, this is the reason that, we had to enact these austerity, like this is the reason we had to cut the government budget so that we didn't have a huge deficit to join the EU. So it's easier to blame the EU because they were joining it. And so all of these changes and reforms, both good and bad, but usually, negative things tend to get more attention, were blamed on Europe.
Gotcha.
So if you lost any sort of like thing that was cut when they were trying to cut their budget deficit, or whatever the other, like controlling inflation, I forget the other criteria for joining, it was easier to blame Europe. And I don't think that was Russian involvement. I think that was domestically cultivated.
Right.
Because I know that Poland does not have a good relationship with Russia. And so the fact that it's happening there and, all over, it's a good way to draw some sort of comparison where you say, okay, there is something else here.
Right. This is domestic bank mess uppery, not international intrigue.
Even in the US, a lot of populist or America first tendency or things came from, we, lost all of our manufacturing jobs to other countries around the world. That means that other countries around the world are the worst. And so we're the best because we lost our jobs. And so it's cultivated domestically. Obviously it's international in the root of it, but it's a sentiment that comes from, something that happens at home. And whatever is perceived to be the cause of this, whether that's correct or not, is what's going to get all the blame. And so in Hungary, it's Europe. Here, it's just globalization or open free trade type deals.
Gotcha. Yeah. If only we were all economists, then we'd know what's going on, right? It wouldn't be an issue.
Everyone should take Econ. Econ classes are very important.
Yeah, I took AP Econ a long time ago. I enjoyed it.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I don't think I could do high level econ because I can't do the math. But I feel like this is maybe just me talking because I'm college educated and I think it's important, but like understanding the basics of how the world works, including economics, might be beneficial just in general.
Yeah.
You know, like who knew? And so, you know, like that's why, I mean, I had to do this because I wanted to do so many different things at Lawrence, but like I took classes in everything. And it was because it's like, I want to understand what's going on with everything. And like, that was very helpful to me. Now I can have a conversation with you about international economics. And I know what's going on. You know, or at least I can follow along and know enough to answer questions or ask questions.
Oh no, and that's awesome. And I mean,
Right.
I feel like the cool thing about economics, just in general, not to kind of like pull the
we can pull the charade of talking about your research down. You can talk about it, like, anything you want.
You could have a different economist on here every day or every week, and you'd be like talking about a completely different thing because, you know, a niche of banking policies in Europe is my niche, but, you know, someone could talk about like education, or if a college opens in your town, how does that affect both employment and the rate at which people go to school and things like that. And you could have another person talking about if your factory closes, what's going to happen, you know, everything can be, you know, you can have a million different economic papers. You can
exactly. Right. Yeah, we could, you know,
and it would be just as involved of a debate. And it's a very great field. And a lot of social science fields have that really nice sort of human element that is both difficult when we study humans, because of course that's
because we're humans.
But it makes research very accessible to a broad audience when you're talking about things that are the real world, and they're less dry, so to speak.
Yeah. You know, I was a history major, so like I get what you're talking about. And I feel like a lot of just regular people don't understand that there is debate in economics and there is debate in history, and like they're just like, oh well, you know, the economy, and like the economists say this, and it's like, yeah, but there are thousands of economists, and not all of them are going to come to the same conclusion, even if you give them the same stuff. You know, it's like it's the same thing with history. Like I remember when I don't know, did you ever take an AP history class?
I did back in the day. Yes, I did take AP history.
You had to do those DBQs, right?
Yeah.
So they hand you this stuff, and they're like, okay, answer this question about it. And you know, the millions of kids who took that test, not a single one of us wrote the same essay, I assume, because you know, each person is going to see the data differently and come to a different conclusion. It's the same thing with economics, you know, and there are some people who are economists who, you know, look at a data and then they say, well, we're going to exclude this part and we're just going to make it so that this is what, you know, I'm sure you've run across that.
Or if you only study these 4 people, then you can draw the conclusion that I wanted. Yes. Oh my gosh.
Only survey
it's
one billionaire.
You're supposed to do your analysis and then write up your conclusion. So it's unethical to kind of tailor the paper that you want or the result that you want. But you know, it's not, that happens with bad people in every discipline. I mean, it happens in biology or physics, or, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Which is sad, makes me cry.
I know. I was like, no unethical science anymore, or social science or history.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I know, you know, when I was doing my my capstone at Lawrence, or the class before that is the history of history, which is so boring. But it's basically like writing a review article is the class. And like I wrote mine about the Armenian genocide, and that's a topic in history that is so, you know,
a very charged
contested. Yeah. And like I'm reading through all this stuff and I just realized like none of these people are actually looking at sources. None of these people care. They have their point and then they're just figuring it out afterwards. And it happens in everything. But it's, you know, it's the same idea. You know, it's like, oh, I want to prove that trickle down economics works. Let me take these like 5
I'm gonna find the one business that helped.
And say that, see, look, it happened this one time. So clearly it works.
Oh my God, right. That's that's the one that drives me up the wall. I mean, I teach intermediate macro, and so we have to talk about that a little bit. There's a little bit of like a history of the US macroeconomy element to that, just a little bit.
Yeah.
And I have to include the disclaimer where I was like, yes, this was like a belief, but like now we're 20, 30 years later, we're like not seeing anything about it. So it's clearly not.
No one has seen the trickle yet. It hasn't happened
right
yet.
Like obviously it sounds great, but it's one of those too good to be true things. Like, yeah, if it were that easy, like obviously it would have already happened. But
right. Yeah, no, and instead the rich people are going to space.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of that too, where you're just kind of like, well, that's not correct, but some people still will like ride or die.
Yeah,
like,
fight for it.
Right, that we did this.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to convince someone otherwise.
That they're wrong, especially when it's one of those like their core beliefs.
Oh yeah, because people don't like to be proven wrong, and let alone when it's something that they very much are all about.
Oh well. Well, cool. Banking reform in Hungary. That's awesome. Yeah. I'm Austrian, so like that's like right in my
neighbors.
right in my wheelhouse. Yeah. We were once the same country, but not really. Yeah, no, that's super cool. Is there anything else that, since you're on the internet and you have this floor as a new public face for the economists everywhere, do you want to say anything? Or
oh wow, that's a
soapbox? I know I'm just gonna spring it on you. You can say whatever you want.
No, I mean, I guess if I had to say anything, I would probably say listen to the experts in economics. But obviously, there's so many sources out there. It is very difficult to kind of sift through what's good and what's bad. And so, a lot of it just comes down to there's scholarly research, there's disputed scholarly research. And so to form any sort of opinion on the economy is not easy. And so if it is overwhelming, or if you do feel like this seems wrong, dig a little bit more, because there's so much out there, and it's such a difficult concept to grasp. And that's why, when you take an econ major, you take 10 different classes all on different parts of the economy, because it's so massive and it's so difficult to understand. So, if it's an intimidating topic or anything like that, it shouldn't be. It should be a very interesting thing to learn about, and to have it's valid to have an opinion on the economy, but just to make sure that, it is supported and not fringe or strange or indefensible. So to speak.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Hannah, for coming on and talking about your research and your interests. Yeah, if you're watching this and you have questions for Hannah that I didn't ask, go ahead and comment down below. And I know Hannah personally, so I can make sure that she knows that you have a question, and we can get it answered for you.
Oh yeah, I'd love that.
Yeah, 100%. These videos aren't just to be watched. You can interact with them. So yeah, let us know, and I'll make sure Hannah knows what's happening, and we can get your questions answered. And Hannah, if you ever want to come back and talk about something else you're interested in.
Absolutely. If I write another paper, or if I have another very cool, interesting thing that happens, I'll be sure to send Mike an email. So
yeah, sounds great. We'll keep it going, because I love making these and it's fun. So
awesome. Thank you for having me.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Really fun. Yeah,
for sure. All right. Well, bye. See you later. Thanks for watching.